as a topic that we also needed to address as Black people, not only race and racism, right? What I heard from being, connected and having conversations with my family and friends is that it's not only important to have others of different races talk about systemic racism, but that it was past time to really hold up a mirror to ourselves and start digging into some of these issues that could be so personal and so sensitive for so many of us who experience it. And so that's the genesis of the conversation. We have a few people here with us today to discuss and share their experiences, both personally, from their personal experiences in Haiti, outside of Haiti, across the world, how they've experienced colorism. We also have quite a few, these amazing professors who have actually researched the topic, colorism specifically in Haiti and outside of Haiti, how it manifests, to just shed some light on what it is, what this colorism is and how people experience it. And then hopefully we'll end with some good pointers for what we do moving forward, right? In the middle of the conversation, we will open it up for Q&A, so please have your questions ready. We don't have a lot of time because this is a very intense conversation. We don't want to overwhelm you, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started and introduce our panelists as I bring them into the conversation instead of doing all of the introductions in the beginning. Our first panelist is Edwige Jean-François. Edwige is an award-winning journalist and media consultant. She is a former CNN senior producer who has covered major news and features in the Americas, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. She has produced reports for Vital Signs with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, and launched a number of CNN International Africa programs. And those are only a very few of her accomplishments. Prior to CNN, Edwige was a White House producer with the AP television news service based in Washington, DC. And Edwige, I know personally that one of the stories that you've reported on is the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And you were one of the first CNN teams on the ground, and you managed to secure that interview that Dr. Gupta did with former President Rene Preval when you all got there. And so thinking about these experiences that you've had all over the world, all over Haiti, talk to us about how you've managed to do such awesome work, and at the same time, while doing it, how you face colorism and how that's factored into your work and your life personally.
Well, thank you, Michael V, and to the entire Haitian Times team for putting together this panel, as well as good afternoon to my co-panelists. As you mentioned, Michael V, it's a very important topic. And in the space that we, or I should say, I operate as a Haitian American, the focus is often racism as opposed to colorism. So I just want to take you back a little bit to sort of frame my personal experience. I left Haiti when I was 7 years old, and I grew up between the US and Canada. So my identity, as a Haitian American I grew up in a very strong Haitian identified household. Colorism was not something that was a topic or an issue. We have family members of different colors, different hues, as most of you probably do. And I had a father who was very grounded in the Haitian experience. So the stories we heard about Haiti was the Haiti of lore, la caille c'est la caille, like the beautiful stories. So that was sort of like my framework and the reference point that I had in my head about Haiti. So when I went back for the first time, probably early to my mid 20s, as a tourist, as a young person looking to discover Haiti after having left for more than 2 decades, it's sort of like my experience from what had been told and how I grew up in New York, in a family or a community where I did not personally experience colorism. But the irony was to have experienced colorism in Haiti with the Haiti of lore in my head, that was home, the ancestral home. And so just to give a couple of examples, one of the ones that stayed with me, which was probably an early experience of colorism, a group of us had gone to a bal, like at the popular Haitian dance parties at Florville, like way up above Pétionville with some friends and some family. It was at a T-Vice bal. And you know, at one point, people start to move and scatter about, and I found myself on a side of the party where coincidentally everybody around me was lighter skinned, and you started to get a sense of sort of getting a stare, or almost like you didn't sort of belong in that space. And I looked around, and surprisingly, I saw that Haitians who had my complexion were on one side of the room, and then Haitians who had lighter skin were on another side of the room. And I was very puzzled because I'd never been in a situation where, as a Black person, I saw that color dynamic. And I remember inquiring about it, and somebody who lived in Haiti said, essentially, it can get to be that way. And so that was very, very surprising to me. And later on, as I continued to work in Haiti and go there for the different projects, I saw the extension of that in the service sector. These days, we oftentimes talk about frontline workers. So people who were sort of like the front of the house versus the back of the house at restaurants, and started to notice a color complexion in terms of who had some of those positions, and even the service. When I would go to a restaurant and I was with some white colleagues, it would be the deference to sort of take their order first, even though I was the only woman at the table, and generally you go to the woman first. And so to me, it's sort of been this strange situation, because as we address some of these issues, you mentioned, Malcolm, about racism and trying to fight the other isms here in the US, to have found that play out in different forms in Haiti. And as a corollary to that, I also found, because as a journalist, I've been fortunate to be across different spaces in Haiti, you know, interviewing the local merchant or the average ordinary Haitian, to Haitians at the highest level of business and government. And I found that the French language in and of itself, it became a sort of like a caste system. You know, we've been using that word caste of late. And those Haitians who don't speak French and are dark complexion are in a real conundrum. So where is that space that you fit in? So my observation, not as a scholar, just as a ordinary Haitian, is I've come to conclude that all of that manifests as what I see the vestiges of colonialism and some of these things that have sort of spilled over into our culture over the decades, over the centuries, and still manifest today.
Wow, that's those are really some amazing examples of how it can manifest. I myself remember maybe 15, 20 years ago, this like phrase that people would say all the time at T-Vice balls, not to pick on T-Vice necessarily, but I do recall, you know, the phrase, some of you may also know it, right? There's, how did it go? Gen mouche nan let lan, right? That sort of thing. And I know there were polemics that came out of, you know, T-Vice being like the group for lighter skinned Haitians, and the other groups being the ones that people of darker complexions preferred and whatnot. So it's interesting that that experience happened to you at a T-Vice bar, because I'd never heard of it, you know, from someone who had actually experienced it in real time. So thank you for sharing that. So now let's give some time to Joanne, because Joanne, you grew up in Haiti and the US, right? Most of your education took place in Haiti, and now you're a health consultant in Florida. I'll introduce you very briefly, and then just if you could tell us how that experience has been for you, being of both worlds. I think that would be interesting for our attendees. So Joanne Belizier, as we said, is a health consultant with the Florida Department of Health based in Duval County, Florida. She's a foreign medical doctor certified by the Education Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, and she holds a Master of Healthcare Administration from George Washington University, excuse me. So prior to moving to the US, Joanne lived in Haiti and graduated from the Université Notre Dame d'Haïti, the medical school there, and completed training at the Teaching Hospital of Peace in Port-au-Prince. After the 2010 earthquake, which again keeps coming up because it's had such an impact on so many lives, Joanne moved to the US permanently, and she's based in Jacksonville, Florida now. So Joanne, yes, coming back to you, tell us how you function and experienced some of the colorism issues that Idvij brought up. How was it for you?
Thank you for the introduction. First of all, I would like to say that when I was in Haiti, when I was being raised in Haiti, the term colorism never came up. Like, it's not something that you know that you're being raised at doing, but you just know that there are certain habits that you develop, or certain things that they teach you, and at the end, like as an adult, I came to understand that these were colorism traits. But I wasn't, when I was being raised in Haiti, I wasn't told, or I did not understand it to be of colorism. For example, the same way Edwidge talk about, um, speaking French is some quote unquote part sometime of the colorism, because I was fortunate to go to all my life to l'école Caïmé. I'm a l'école Caïmé, a graduate since elementary school to high school, and even the University of Notre Dame is a Catholic school. So all my life I've been élève Caïmé. So I've indulged the Caïmé teaching, and one of the Caïmé teaching is, for example, proper French speaking. Like in society, you succeed if you know how to speak French well, if you express yourself well in French, if you're very literate in French. So that was part of my upbringing. And another thing also that you learn, that the as you succeed in life, it makes more sense if you rise up in terms of color than rise down. A word that they use for that is améliorer la race. Like, for example, if you're darker skin and when you're succeeding in life, you tend to marry or to enter somebody, it's either same tone of skin as you or lighter skin. And that's why they call améliorer la race. You don't tend to go further down your complexity tone. So, but as I say, when I was being raised, it did not occur to me that it was colorism. It was just the way of society, the way that we do things, the way that we do business in Haiti. Um, it was maybe coming here to the US. And as I said, I've never experienced either racism or colorism. But when I came here to the US, well, first of all, when I was in Haiti, I'd never questioned my blackness. It was natural to me that, there are four races on earth. You're either born white, you're born black, you're born Asian, I mean yellow, or you're born Native American, which is like kind of a red complexion, or you can be a mixture of all. So I never questioned my blackness. I never thought that one race was better than the other. But since I also experienced the American culture, because it was like 9 months in Haiti, 3 months in the United States. So that's when I started to realize that, being black is an issue in other countries, like in the US, where it's not an issue in Haiti. So maybe I could say that both cultures kind of opened my eyes to realize that there's more than this little bubble where I feel comfortable of being Elev Kaime, of taking advantage. Because I always say I'm the product of the advantage of being Elev Kaime. I've I've had a lot of many social advantages because I was Elev Kaime, and I'm probably where I am today because I was Elev Kaime. So that's why I say the system benefited me, but, but because I was able to see outside of the system, being in connection with the American system, I kind of realized that there are some flaws in it because there's no perfect system nowhere. There's not a perfect system in Haiti. There's not a perfect system here. So I've realized that the system in Haiti has its flaws, and that's when I realized that the flaws is colorism, because we do have the tendency to classify people, even though we realize we all agree that we're a black nation, but we don't treat all blacks the same. So it's only coming here to the US I realized that.
Hmm. Joanne, tell me, when did it strike you? Is there a particular moment or a couple different moments where, you had the realization that something was flawed with the way things were in Haiti? Like
I
any
think when I came
pushback
to
that
live
you
here, mostly when I came to live here in 2010, because before I used to travel here in the United States for, either summer vacation, like for a certain time. I came here for summer vacation, 2, 3 months to go back to Haiti. I didn't really live here, so I didn't really indulge the American culture. But it's only when I start living here that I start realizing that here, whatever you're light skinned black or dark skinned black, you're black. And they treat you no differently because you're black. While I say to myself, but when I'm in Haiti, I'm like a privileged black because, élève l'école caille and I'm not that dark skinned and stuff like that. So why is it that here I don't have that same privilege? And that's when it hit me.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot to dig into. And I think we'll let Professor Emeritus Alex Dupuy weigh in for a little bit on what Edwige and Joanne have shared so far. And by way of introduction, Alex Dupuy, as I said, is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. He's internationally recognized as a scholar and specialist on Haiti. He's written several books, including From Revolutionary Slaves to Powerless Citizens, essays on the politics and economics of underdevelopment in Haiti from 1804 to 2012. So we will send out a list of resources for everyone to check out after this, and this book will be on it. I think it'll be good reading for all of us to follow up and understand like what's been happening with Haiti and how we've gotten to where we are now in this society. So Professor, over to you. Tell us what your thoughts are from a historical context on what Edwige and Joanne have described. Oh, I think you're on mute, Alex.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Well, I also grew up in Haiti and came to the US to pursue my university education. And I grew up in a predominantly mulatto family, but like all mulatto families in Haiti, there's a range of all skin colors and so on, but most of them were also part of the upper class. And so the experience was different in that sense. It wasn't until, I was made aware of color differences, but it was mostly against the lower classes rather than the people in the class that I grew up with. But as with other forms of racism and colorism, it was expected that I would marry someone within the mulatto family or outside of Haiti. So in that sense, there was an awareness on my part of the color prejudices that existed. But in what I would prefer to do here is to put all this issue of color differences and racial differences in the historical context, because I think as both of you have spoken, alluded to, colorism is a derivative of racism. And the concept of race became developed in the modern sense of the term in the beginning in the late 16th, 17th centuries, when Europe colonized the New World and began to bring African slaves into the New World to work on the plantations. And as with other forms of racism, the objective is to naturalize social differences based on the perception of differences of people with different skin colors. And so this is how, in fact, it developed, because racism and colorism were not invented, were not developed simply to distinguish between groups of people on the basis of the color of their skin, but to also hierarchize them, to create a social hierarchy where those at the bottom could be exploited and the justification could be exploited on the ground that they are lesser, or they are less worthy, they are meant to be exploited. Just like the colonialists saw the Africans as exploitable subjects. Now, in the context of Saint-Domingue, which became one of the most productive slave colonies in the world, they also developed what would be called a class of free people of color, which included mulattoes, but also some blacks who had been freed. And they were categorized as free people of color. Now, the free people of color experienced discrimination from the whites in the colony, who barred them from many professions like medicine and law and so on, but they weren't prevented from owning property and, in fact, even owning slaves. And so what you had happen at towards in the 18th century and beyond was that the mulatto class began to acquire property, along with some free blacks who became property owners and even slave owners. But the majority of slave owners in that category were mulattoes. And together, the free people of color, with the predominance of mulattoes among them, own about 28% of the properties, and they were about 28% of the population. And they became quite wealthy, and initially opposed the abolition of slavery because they also bought into the racism of the Europeans, that blacks were inferior and so on. But also with the free people of color, which included many blacks also came to own slaves. In fact, as I mentioned in our conversation yesterday, Toussaint Louverture himself owned slaves before he joined the revolution to abolish slavery. And initially, the mulatto leaders opposed the abolition of slavery and fought against Toussaint's regime, but lost that battle. When Bonaparte sent Leclerc to reconquer the colony and rekindle the civil war against the French, mulatto leaders at that time broke with Bonaparte and broke with the French and joined the revolution to launch, with Dessalines as a leader, to launch the final battle for independence. After Haiti became independent, the country, after Dessalines died, after he became the first president, named himself emperor, the country became divided between the North and the South, so to speak, geographically, where mulattoes dominated mostly in the South, and Christophe and the Black elites dominated in the North. After Pétion died, Christophe killed himself, Pétion died, the country was reunified under Boyer, President Jean-Pierre Boyer, and became a single country at the time. But the divisions between mulattoes and blacks didn't stop. In fact, they began to manifest themselves into a struggle for power between the two factions of the elite. That struggle continued throughout the 19th century and led from one coup d'etat after another. In fact, if you want an interesting, of the 23 presidents between 1804 and 1915, when the US occupied Haiti, 16 were overthrown by military coups. So the color question continued throughout the 19th century to justify the conflicts between the two sides, where the mulattoes adopted the racist European ideology that they were superior to the blacks, and the blacks themselves adopted a nationalist ideology where they said because they were black, they were the most capable, the most representative of the population. So this is how these ideologies manifested themselves. But still, there was a unity among the elites in terms of their ambitions to own property, to own wealth. And as mentioned before, the French language became a mark of social distinction and social differentiation between the elites and the lower classes. That struggle continued all the way through the American occupation, which favored mulattoes in the presidency. But after 46, Estimé came to power. And from that point on, it led to a subsequent reign by Black elites and Black members of the bourgeoisie, culminating in a Duvalier dictatorship, who in fact launched a rampage and a killing rampage against mulatto families in '64. Duvalier was finally, after he died, his son Jean-Claude took over, married a mulatto woman as a sort of peace gesture with the mulatto elite. But those two factions continue to dominate economically. And in fact, I can give you a brief statistic to show you the distinction in terms of the data. 60%, this is of 2018 data, the latest that I have, 60% of the Haitian population lives in poverty. 24% among them are in extreme poverty. The top 10% of the population, which includes both mulattoes and Blacks, appropriate 50% of the national income. And the top 1% of the population have 50 times more resources than the bottom 10%. So what you have is an extremely class differentiated society where, you know, there is a social question about colorism that manifests itself primarily in the form of choices for partners, for marriage. But there is no systematic institutional discrimination in Haiti, as you have in the United States, that prevent Blacks from rising to the top. And one of the means by which many of the members of the Black middle class and elite have gained access to wealth is through controlling the state. And the state has always been used as a source of enrichment in what my friend and colleague Robert Fatton has called la politique du ventre, the politics of the belly. Is when you gain power, you enrich yourself by siphoning money off the treasury. As we can see happening today in the protests against Jovenel Moïse, who is a successful banana planter. In fact, his nickname is Neg Banan. And so that continues to be the case. So the colorist question, while it has effects on people's lives on an everyday and institutional basis at that point, is primarily to be understood, in my view, better understood as a class question, where the solidarity among the upper classes in many ways transcends their color differences, insofar as they are able to continue to exploit the lower classes. So in that sense, this is why I think that the color question in Haiti is fundamentally different from the way it manifests itself, say, in the United States, where there are institutional forms of racism that you would not necessarily find in Haiti, because in Haiti, it's access to wealth and resources that determines your future and your possibilities. So I'll end there and let others take up from there.
Oh, that was a really great overview, Alex. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I mean, what strikes me is just how intentional the whole aspect of it, you call it, you know, naturalizing social differences, right? And making sure that the social hierarchy exists so that the people at the top can justify how they treat people at the bottom, which is not so different at all from what we've seen in slavery. And I know that someone in the chat had typed that it is a little bit frustrating for us to be talking about, you know, slavery and colonialism when we're talking about colorism in 2021. But I hope that what Alex has shared really gives a broader perspective of how intentional this system has been from the beginning. And then we'll dive a little bit into what we can do today to address that question and maybe help people actually be able to address it in a meaningful way going forward. So now let's go over to Philippe. Dr. Philippe Richard-Marius, I hope you can get a little bit more into just the intentionality, right, of colorism from a political perspective and how it serves different folks in Haiti, as well as outside of Haiti, through your research, what you found. So Dr. Marius is a social anthropologist, as Rachel said in the beginning. He teaches in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island. He's also involved with the Master of Liberal Studies program there. So his forthcoming book, This Is How We Met, I'm really looking forward to this book, is actually titled Race, Class, and Privilege in Post-Colonial Bourgeois Society. It's due out this year, and I, for one, can't wait. So Philippe, over to you, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give also a brief historical overview that can help understand colorism in Haiti. as a societal concern, right? As a societal dynamics, and it's also totalizing, meaning you can't really decide that you're not part of it or you're outside of it, of that dynamic. And I think it can also give some context to what both Edwige and Joanne expressed as their personal experiences. And also in terms of, as a social scientist, you really don't do social science in some kind of vacuum. So I guess I should also say that, as Alex pointed out, within the privileged classes, the elites of Haiti, the color question exists, right? But there is this interaction. Alex mentioned the US occupation favoring mulattoes. The first president installed by the US occupiers, Sud Dartignave, was married to my grandmother's cousin, first cousin. So my grandmother was from the southern political elite, and my grandfather was from the black southern political elite. So I've had kind of a personal experience, a front row seat, if you will, in terms of the dynamics, the color dynamics. In For historical context, and I'll try to be pretty brief while not being incoherent. First, let us remember in this idea of Haiti as a black country really started in 1805, officially, formally, because Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in the Constitution of 1805, literally made Haitian a black country. No matter what color you were, in terms of complexion or what formation you belong to, the mulattoes or the black formation, you are black officially. Now, what is very important about this is the fact that Dessalines was trying to prevent the elite, the new elite, the elite of the new nation. Dessalines was trying to prevent them into breaking into color groups. So it's very important I'm pointing that out because today you have the same situation as Dessalines was dealing with, and that is a problem within the elite. It has nothing to do with the condition of the quote unquote masses of the people. It really is an issue that the elite is trying to manage, and it's an issue that exists only within the elite. It does not exist outside of the elite, even today in Haiti. And when Dessalines died, this whole idea of Haiti being an officially black country went out the window. There's another president who started that. Not in any other constitution was it ever mentioned that Haiti is a black country. And when we entered after independence, the mulattoes, for the most part, and also when you talk about mulattoes, as Alex mentioned, there were many blacks who had owned slaves and entered the new nation with certain privileges that people usually think of as mulatto privilege, including a French education and education in dominant French ways, dominant European ways. And the black elite, who had been more recently freed, self-liberated from slavery, did not have that education, but they really made it a political project to get that education. And by the late 1800s, there was a fairly expansive black elite and middle class, very fluent in dominant ways of Europe, including language, but not just language, the way you carry yourself, the way you hold your fork and knife. These are ways that to this day, dark-skinned, light-skinned Haitians use to differentiate themselves from non-privileged Haitians. And these are, rather than to avoid confusion, I think of Haiti between the bilingual minority population, and we're talking about 5% of the population, bilingual, across color, who internally deal with colorism, but externally are united in dominating the vast majority of monolingual Creole speakers, right? And In the late 1800s, in 1870, the Black elite and the middle class elite started to politicize the Blackness. And as Alex pointed out, they started claiming leadership of the country on the basis of being Black, right? But this is a historic Blackness. It's the Blackness of the founding fathers, right? To this day in Haiti, if you're going to describe any one of us here on the panel, from Alex to those of us of darker complexion, nobody is ever going to would ever use the word Black. If you're in Haiti, you grew up in Haiti in the privileged classes, there is a vast vocabulary of privilege, a vocabulary of social color that will indicate a person of darker complexion, but it does not include the word Black in it. It has marabout, brun, grief, but the word Black is not part of that vocabulary in day-to-day practice to describe somebody, right? As a matter of fact, there's a term that Haitians use sometimes, li gon ti couleur. And if you ask what color that is, nobody will give you any precision, because that says a lot, that it says what it needs to say. That person is not Black, because Black is the one in the masses.
Right.
And there are, there are a couple of songs by Jazz Desjeunes where the guy is in love with a marabout. Then the guy is in love with a Mabrune, Gérard Duperville. But when it comes to a negresse Botiguave that he's in love with, ça c'est un petit machin, un negresse, un petit machin. So there's always that connotation when you're talking about Black, it's a lower class Black, and you link the Blackness to a lower social condition. To this day that exists in Haiti. And the other thing that I'd like to say is, Joanne pointed it out, Alex pointed out, is the idea of améliorer la race, right? If you're dark skin privilege, there may be a tendency to marry somebody of lighter complexion. But to understand this, we need to understand the context of in which Haiti was created. Haiti was founded as a nation state in the Atlantic world. So the Blacks needed to acquire competencies in European culture, principally French, because you needed to know, you needed to be fluent in European culture if you're a nation of the Atlantic world. In order to have diplomatic relation, in order to have commercial relation, you had to be able to speak the language and comport yourself by the norms of the elites of the Atlantic. Well, if you can think of that, if you can think of culture in that way, think of color in the same way. Because the elites of Haiti, of the new nation, not only they were conscious of the importance of dominant European cultures and went after it, they were also very cognizant of the fact that the Atlantic world privileged lightness of complexion. So they were guarding that as a capital, just like cultural capital. So lightness of complexion became a social capital, if you will, or a symbolic capital. So we need to keep that in mind to understand why it's not only mulatto prejudice, color prejudice we're talking about, but it's also strategies by dark-skinned privileged Haitian to acquire lightness of complexion in the lineage, because lightness of complexion is a symbolic capital that works, that articulates with cultural capital for people who are negotiating their situation in the privileged classes, right? And the other thing we need to remember, and I'll flip back to the War of Independence, is the fact that Alex mentioned that mulatto leaders had returned with Bonaparte's expedition to try to put down the revolution. But before the mulatto leaders joined the revolution, Dessalines, Christophe, joined the French army to fight other Black armies. And those other Black armies were slaves who had been born in Africa. They were African natives. Dessalines, Christophe, and other formerly enslaved military leaders fighting the revolution had been born in the colony. So you have this split where first Dessalines Christophe joined the French with the mulattoes to fight the Black armies of African natives. And today, right, the monolingual Creole speaking Haitian, the quote unquote masses, are the social descendants of these African armies. So this, what we're seeing today, what Edwidge alluded to in terms of that discrimination between the front of the house and the kitchen really dates from then. And the way I would suggest to interpret what Edwidge's experience is the fact that it really is class-based, because on the one hand, you have this tendency for privilege to lighten the complexion, even among Black people, dark-skinned Haitian, that is. And also, you have the fact that the truly bilingual, the population of Haitians who is truly literate in French, fluent in French and other dominant Western cultural norms, right, is really minute. So you are going to have a tendency within your social circle, if you're privileged to own an upscale restaurant, an upscale hotel, an upscale patisserie, you are going to have a tendency to know people, even if they're quote unquote from the Black formation, tend to be of a lighter complexions and are fluent in French, then you're going to find somebody with a dark complexion and is fluent in French, which begins to explain on a class basis rather than color why you have this tendency to have a lighter complexion, relatively lighter, right? We're not talking about somebody who's fair complexioned, relatively lighter complexion, who will still be part of the Black formation than you will find in the kitchen, if you will, where that tends to be from the monolingual Creole speaking population, which because of they are not privileged, they don't have the same tendency to arrive at some kind of lightness of complexion in the lineage. Right?
So, Mac, may I ask a question of
Yeah.
mine? So what I'm understanding, Philippe, is you're saying that, so when I've gone and observed that it so happens that the lighter Haitians are working the registers or have the more so-called plush positions in the kitchen, you know, the quote unquote workers are the darker skinned Haitians, that the hiring practice you're telling me is based on the fact that the frontline folks that we see speak French, as opposed to what I see as branding and what the brand may want to represent their business. You're saying it's because those people speak French that they got the frontline?
I would, you might find exception because you might have been in a place where exceptionally it doesn't work that way. But generally speaking, yes, that has been my experience doing field work around the issue of color and class belonging in Haiti, right? Because by and large, if you're a dark-skinned Haitian who is of means, who has family members who are dark-skinned and are totally fluent in French, they would not hesitate to put them in the front of the house. Nor, by and large, would mulattoes would avoid such a place if that's where they want to eat, if that's where they want to buy their patty or whatever on a Sunday morning. You will not find, I don't think you would find mulattoes avoiding a place where the front of the house is not of lighter complexion. That's
So
been
does that mean the language is more of an indicator than the color?
not only it's more of an indicator, it's the ultimate barrier of class. Cultural competence in Haiti is the ultimate barrier of class, right?
So you're saying French is the gatekeeper?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think this is why this is just so elastic, right? because it sounds like anybody could be anything depending on what you have or what you started out with and like where you are, right? You could be darker skinned and be considered mulatto even depending on how much property or, you know, investments you have, it sounds like. Or you could be lighter or fairer skinned, but if you don't have much, then you could be part of the broader like masses, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I think that's why this is so fascinating, and it strikes me as being odd that some people in Haiti who are Haitian, people here in the US too actually wonder what colorism in Haiti, right? And so I'm really just pleased that we're able to get together and have this conversation, because it's not something people imagine or that's a one-off that they experience. From what you're sharing, this has been a very intentional way of being from the very origins of Haiti as the first Black Republic, right? It's a loaded term for sure, but it makes me wonder. I understand there was a pragmatic utility to having cultural fluency, right? So you could be able to negotiate with the other Atlantic nation states at the time and all of that. But maybe this is for another time, the drawbacks, right, of that very pragmatic way of being. I wonder if anyone thought through what it could actually snowball into to where we are now over the centuries, which I think is what the issue is. Like it started out as one way for one reason, and over time it's just kind of, you know, turned into what it is, to the point now where it's just the way things are, but no one is really addressing it. I'll get off my soapbox now and bring in Stephanie Legault Willis, who's joined us today to talk about her experience as a Haitian American, primarily born and raised in the US. Before I cede the floor to Stephanie, I'll just introduce her really quickly. Stephanie is an attorney based in Louisiana, where she has witnessed the inherent disparities within the framework of the Louisiana criminal system. She's successfully represented disenfranchised and people and litigated claims against governmental entities, both at the state and federal level. She's also represented among those cases, minorities who've been racially profiled and brutalized at the hands of law enforcement. Unfortunately, that's something we're all, you know, too familiar with. And over the past couple of years, Stephanie has actually begun to co-found Conscious Union, which is a social platform that aims to debunk stereotypes that lead to the unfair and unjust treatment of minorities, specifically those from immigrant nations. So Stephanie, let me start with you there. Can you walk us through why you felt it was necessary to actually have this platform? What was the moment or event that triggered you to actually say, I have to do something about this?
Sure. Thank you again for having me this afternoon. So as you mentioned, Conscious Union was co-founded. It was co-founded with cousins of mine, actually, and it was after the former president, who shall remain nameless, referred to Haitians as individuals from shithole countries. And we all know that's far from the truth. And so there's also always a stigma placed against individuals who were of Haitian descent or who were from Haiti. And we decided at that point that we had to do something about it. And we wanted to focus primarily on individuals between the ages of like 18 and I guess like 40, because that was the age in which we were at that time, so just to have them be more involved. And we were just of the opinion that we wouldn't allow his remarks to place such a negative light on not only our people from Haiti, but also individuals from the African diaspora as a whole. And so that was the reason why we founded it. If we want to talk about colorism, myself personally, I've had certain instances with colorism within the Haitian community, unfortunately, but I think the first time that that my eyes were truly open to it was my best friend. I think I was probably a freshman or a sophomore in high school. And we were just having a conversation like we normally do, had the music blaring in the background. And, she just kind of looked at me one day and she said, it's really not fair. I said, like, what are you talking about? And she said, it's not fair. And I should preface by saying that she is one of the most confident individuals that I know. And I would say at that time, probably more confident in herself as a teenager than I was. And she said, it's really just not fair that because you are of a lighter complexion than me, individuals view you as prettier than I am. And my first inclination was to say, that's not true at all. But her comments really just opened up a Pandora's box for me. And so I just started paying closer attention, within the tight Haitian community. And I was just slowly seeing examples of colorism, or just even thinking back during my upbringing, growing up as a Haitian American here in the United States. One of the things I have to agree with Philippe here is that French is is a way of demonstrating your social class. If you speak French, then you are somehow above someone else who does not. And I can recall a lot of individuals who were friends of my parents, who were of a lighter complexion, whom they spoke French to each other at all times. And we know that there's the instance where, you're speaking to an adult, and so there's the respect and you have to speak French. That's another story for a different day. But even amongst themselves as adults, they were speaking French to each other. And I just didn't understand that, because I saw that everybody during everyday life, you spoke Creole, that's what you did. And it was just more so of a way of showing that they were above. And so that was very striking to me. So I just, from my conversation initially with my friend, it just opened up other examples. For another example would have been the fact that individuals who I would come into contact with, they would ask, what's my background? And I would tell them proudly that I was Haitian, and they would argue with me and tell me that I was not. And I just did not understand that. And they would say, there's no way that you're a full-blood Haitian. Is your mom or your dad something else? And I would say, no. I grew up in a household where I learned about my Haitian history, and I was taught to be proud of who I was and where I came from. And the fact that there is, unfortunately, and I think somebody said that in the chat, that the fact that we're still existing in a slave mentality at this point in time is just, it just goes to show how structured the institution of slavery was and still is. And not only that, just the negative influences that the media or outside countries place on the country of Haiti in itself, I think also promotes colorism within our community. Yeah, I just think that we as a people need to directly face that, because I know that there are individuals who say that it does not exist, and it doesn't exist simply because we are all Black, but that's not the case. And I think having these conversations are a way to essentially fix that, because if we don't address it, then it's just going to be something that's swept under the carpet for a long period of time. And right now is long enough. How do we expect to progress as a people if we can't even fix fix our house, so to say? Another instance where I think that it's truly important that we address is the actual fact that we experience colorism in our profession. And I know Idvij, as a CNN producer, I know that you probably saw that a lot. I used to do some legal analysis on TV, and I would never be able to go on TV like this. Well, prior to the Black Lives Matter movement, never. Not with my coils, not with my curly hair. I can give you another example. When I first came out of law school, I was clerking for a judge, and I truly believe that she was trying to help me. She was a Black female. She was like I believe she was the first Black judge in that city in New Orleans, the first Black city court judge. And I was clerking for her, and I had my hair naturally. And she told me, she said, look, I want you to do well, but you should not come to work like that anymore. If you don't have time to straighten your hair, then you should just put it in a bun, because that's unprofessional. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another instance of colorism. And the problem with that is that she was actually trying to help me. Mm-hmm. It's just a warped sense of living, that she was actually trying to help me, but yet she was forcing me to hide who I was, or my expression of who I am. And, that's just something that runs rampant. It's only now, after the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, that you see individuals on TV that are finally starting to wear box braids or starting to wear their hair naturally. And I just think that's also something that we need to discuss, that we need to address, and that, frankly, I'm glad that we're able to actually be in a position where we're happy with who we are, the texture of our hairs, and just be able to present to people who we are.
This is why I think, Stephanie, your experience is so fascinating from a Haitian American perspective, right? And Joanne touched on this earlier. Like in Haiti, we're all Black, right? Although we have these color distinctions and everything else. So we're Black, but it's assumed everyone's Black and it's fine. You'll just have your station in life. And then we immigrate, to the US, and we bring our own like colorism issues with us. And then America says, wait, you're all really, really Black. And like, here's the box that you belong to. So now you have to deal with it both as a Haitian in your own family and, wherever, right, personal relationships, your tight-knit circles, and also at work as just a regular Black person. And now you have to face, colorism from Dominicans, from Jamaicans,
yes,
from African Americans. It's just never ending. So being mindful of time, we won't be able to go back and forth and get comments from everyone on the panel. But because I did want to try to get to some questions we have. The chat has just been blowing up with different people weighing in. So let's go to some questions. And while I get through them, some of them were interesting comments. If there's anything else, Joanne or Idvij, you'd like to add after listening to what Philippe and Alex and Stephanie have shared, you could go ahead for a minute while I pull up some questions.
So for me, listening to everybody on the panel has been very informative, and hearing it from Haitian scholars, because I think part of addressing it is also being able to evolve and what information that I absorbed, and being able to put it in the framework that both Philippe and Alex have talked about. Having seen, again, we keep saying the majority of Haitians, how color and also language, as I said, has been weaponized in a sense. And when you think about it, language is a tool, right, that you use like education or degrees, and it shouldn't be something that's a marker of whether you have a future or not. So I think of the young Haitian who may be very brilliant, but because he or she does not speak French, does not have the right connections or family, is of a darker complexion, has absolutely no future, because that person speaks a language that nobody values. So devaluing our own native language, our own Creole. Moi-même, toujours levé me parler créole, moi bien parler. It doesn't matter that I left when I was 7. And embracing your Haitian identity. And I think that's the work that needs to be done. I mean, you know, James Baldwin, you know, famously said, you know, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And to an extent, I think there's a bit of pretense in Haiti that everybody sort of, these concepts exist, but we don't talk about it, but we live it. And I was very surprised to find out yesterday that there's 128 different categories. I don't know whether Philippe or Alex wanna, I found that to be very fascinating information in terms of how people were categorized by color casting.
Yeah, I think what Idris is referring to is the just from light to dark, the different, you know, marabout and all of these other descriptors that are used. But it sounds like it's all tied to class, not just the shade of your skin, which is really, really
How do you
something.
figure out 128 ways to
Describe someone.
break down
Well,
Black people?
that was more with the Seminarese classifications during the colonial times, but yeah.
That's insane. We have a question from an attendee by the name of Carla Bascom. I think this is interesting. She would like to know if colorism affects men and boys differently than it affects women and girls. And if so, why do you think that might be the case? And
Yes.
Philippe or Alex?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because at some point, colorism does become gendered because the female body is actually instrumentalized in the reproduction of color, right? Mulatto parents and in the Black formation, parents of lighter skinned girls are very vigilant at guarding that body, who's going to potentially be mated with that body, to put it bluntly, right? Parents in either formations of girls do not mince their vigilance and their words in telling their daughters who is the ideal mate, who is the ideal husband, right? So the female body is definitely instrumentalized in that in the practice of colorism, because this is the ultimate site of the reproduction of potential reproduction of lightness of complexion.
I think Philippe is absolutely right. I think one person who really lays this out very clearly in her work is Micheline Labelle in her, I think, superb book called Idéologie de couleur et classe sociale en Haïti. She lays out really how color plays into the gendered categories and the gendered choices that are encouraged by both members of the elite in terms of marrying lighter as much as possible, and to reproduce precisely the kinds of ideologically entrenched prejudices that have, you know, that exists in the Haitian society. Yeah, absolutely.
And I could even add, if I may, on a personal level, to kind of piggyback on what Philip said. When it comes to calling one another Black, for example, me back in Haiti, I was never called Black. Never, not once. By my peers, by my teacher, never. I knew I was Black, but I was never called Black. And I remember the first time I actually indicated myself to be Black, it was when I'm filling up immigration paper, you know, there's a check box. That's when I say, oh, I am Black. But before that, no. So it's like, just to say that when it comes to gender, like if you're describing me, if somebody is describing me, they will not say the word Black related to me in Haiti.
What might they say?
Well, no, as we mentioned before, they might call me brown, cannelle, caramel, café au lait, whatever, but not Black.
Wow, that's interesting. So now here's, I think, a question that I think we're all thinking, right? I believe this is from Philippe Malbranche, is an attendee here. are attitudes around colorism in retreat, right? Or is there any sort of movement at all? Is there a recognition that this is something that needs to be addressed at a systemic level? I believe is what this is going into.
If I may, was the question directed to someone in particular? Or
No,
just
no one in particular. I think it's just getting into, is there recognition that this colorism within Haitians is something that more and more we're talking about, and that it is in retreat, meaning it's being faced and addressed, like what's happening with it at all beyond us, I think, just talking about it today and bringing it out.
I think that was the purpose of us having this discussion today, because of the fact that it's not really addressed. The fact that there, you know, and I like everyone else do not want to harp on T-Vice, but the fact that, you know, a band would have the, you know, the mitigated gall to be able to make those comments before, you know, before in a bal, you know, that just strikes me as, you know, as it's crazy. But I think that we address this by having these conversations and by being conscious of what actually we do in our everyday lives and how we react to people. Another thing like that I'd like to point out is, and I may get some backlash as a result of this, I'm not saying I've ever experienced this, but I do know that there are individuals, I mean, because in this point right now, we're talking about colorism as individuals of a darker complexion experiencing colorism. But that does happen in the opposite sphere as well. There have been, and I know that there are individuals, I've heard stories of individuals who are of a lighter complexion who have also experienced colorism. One example would be an individual that I know who is very, very light skinned, but is a fervent advocate for Black liberation and Black rights, and, you know, and well within the Haitian community as well. But because she is of a lighter complexion, it's like she's looked down upon, like, you know, what kind of adversities do you face because you are of a lighter complexion? So how dare you, you know, be an advocate for our rights that you have no experience with.
Yeah, I know that Philippe, you like to tell the story about skin lightening creams that you see for people all over the place in your research. So definitely, Stephanie, it does exist. I think even Edwige mentioned the caste system, right? In India, it gets so granular, right? Like where you belong and like what you have the rights to do or not do because of the shade of your skin. It's really mind-boggling. I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll have to move to final comments just to respect everyone's time. And the question comes from Sony Etienne. It is, what role does religious or theological ideologies play in colorism? And Alex or Philip, either one of you could take that one. Religious or theological ideologies and how they perpetrate or not perpetrate colorism.
Philip, go ahead.
I'm not sure, to be quite honest. My question, the only thought I could have right now would be indirectly, because by and large, the education of the privileged classes, and when I speak of colorism in Haiti, rather than speak in terms of elites, or if I'm speaking of elites, I would be doing it in a social science perspective, where when we talk elite, we can include the middle classes as well, because these are classes of people with certain privileges that are not accessible to people outside of those classes, right? And the education that I spoke of really came by way mostly of religious institutions. Joanne alluded to being l'école Caïmé, but up until the late 20th century, there might have been very few schools, elite schools in Haiti that were not parochial schools, right? Yeah, it's only when I returned to Haiti to do fieldwork in 2011, only, I would say it started beginning in the 1990s that these schools started losing their grip on elite imagination. And then you start seeing places like Lycée Français. Lycée Français had been an elite destination in terms of schooling since the 50s, maybe the 60s, but it really was not the only one, right? A lot of elite families proudly send their children to those congregationist schools, be it Saint Rose de Lima, quote unquote, La Lu, Saint Gonzague. So in that way, I would imagine one might begin to investigate and search for some kind of religious influence, because the church in Haiti, as much as the church in feudal Europe and in modern Europe, has always been an ally of power, an ally of political power, right? Oh, leaving aside the Till Église movement and the theology of liberation in Latin America and the Chilean movement in Haiti. Leaving that aside, the church has been an ally of political power throughout the history of Western modernity, throughout the history of the West, which, by the way, if we're talking about colorism, this is where Haiti really belongs, right with the right smack in the history of Western modernity. I mean, I'm absolutely, but that's a conversation for another time.
I think you're right. And another, I think, conversation we'll need to have is the role that language continues to play, because I see in the chat some people are mentioning things like, you know, how blanc is the new name for diaspora, for example, right? Or how a good white person could be un bon nègre. So it's just so fluid how we use language in Haiti and how it's tied more so to, you know, social capital rather than like skin in so many ways. With that said, I know we're over time and I see a ton of resources that people have dropped in here in the chat. So we'll go ahead and compile those and send them to everyone who's registered in the Zoom so that we can continue to inform each other and have these conversations with our own families, friends, and definitely within the broader society. So before I wrap, did anyone else have any final thoughts in terms of like what we can each do with or without resources? Stephanie already mentioned continuing to have conversations like this, but I'm very open to any other thoughts anyone else might have before we wrap.
Well, the only thing I can say is that ideology is a very powerful force. And I think one of the things that people can do is to question where are they getting their views from, or where are their ideas are being formed, and what implications does that have? Because one of the most interesting aspects of ideology is that it appears to be natural, and that's its role, is to, as I said before, naturalize differences. And so if one starts to question those premises, perhaps one could from there beyond and understanding the structural roots of these ideologies and what needs to be done to change those structures. I'll stop here. So.
No, I think that's a great takeaway, that we have to realize these, the way we are, it's not accidental. A group of people or groups of people actually sat down and like thought through how this state was going to be, and this is where they landed, right? So it's not in your head, it's not your family that's this, that, or the other thing. It's really just the way the founding of Haiti started off, just very intentionally.
And it's also pervasive throughout the Black diaspora. You see it in Brazil. There's messages of it everywhere. You go to South Africa, particularly Cape Town, and you see the color divide. And so we see it next door with the Dominican Republic and the sort of fractious relationship there for all sorts of reasons. And I think what we can do, I think, even beyond Haiti, is as Black peoples, people who came with our roots being in Africa, is to just recognize that part of this divide is something that started way before we could even formulate, um, our own identities, and we all are part of it. So awareness, discussion, honesty,
Mhm.
empathy, and I think are some of the ways we start to dismantle what we don't like, and embrace all the beautiful things about being Haitian that we do like.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I will just add a French saying that states un problème posé est un problème à moitié résolu. That
Mhm.
means like if you start, as you said, Edwidge, bringing awareness, if you start actually depicting the problem, then you're closer to finding a solution than if you're in denial.
Mhm.
Uh, if I could, a final thought I would add is I think particularly people of color in their African diaspora, is to be first to be lucid about of our own situationality, right? Earlier, Stephanie mentioned when she arrived clerking for that judge who was an African American and talked to her about her hair and whatnot, whatnot. Before getting there, Stephanie was there with that judge because, like us here, they were speaking a certain type of English. Let us be mindful of that. This is not very different than what I'm describing in Haiti,
Mhm.
right? Stephanie was there not only because she was speaking a certain type of English, but she also bought into a certain dominant way of thinking about the world. That's what got her through law school,
Mhm.
right? I
Mhm.
mean, it's not just going to school, studying this stuff and passing the tests, but it's actually buying into it, buying into what the very concept of the law. I mean, it sounds natural, right? But the very concept of statutory law is something that's, part of the Western, and it's more or less a Western invention, statutory law, as opposed to customary law, or AKA tradition or customs, right?
Mhm.
I mean, these are the kind of things that other people of color, other Blacks, other African Americans might not necessarily have that education or that way of thinking about the world and that way of speaking English for that matter. Right? And these are what gets us into certain places. And when we're there, we can resist colorism, racism, and all the rest of it. But
Mhm.
we do need to do that through the dominant cultures of where we are.
Mhm.
And now it becomes the politics of access to that competence,
Yeah.
which is what Edward was alluding to earlier.
I think this has been such a great first conversation that we've had on colorism. Surely there's room for more conversation around this and all of the different tangents that we can go into, right? From language to class to parallels with African American history and how people across the diaspora have experienced racism, colorism, and all of its various derivatives. So I thank you all who hung out with us today for joining us on this rainy Sunday. I encourage all of you to take what you've heard here to heart and, like Stephanie was saying, embrace your own identity, whatever it may be. Continue to have these conversations honestly, with empathy, as Edwige said. Likewise, Joanne wanted to really say, yes, let's be honest and candid about what it is that we're facing. And to help everyone do that, as I mentioned, we will have some resources for you to help you have that lucidity that Philippe alluded to having, because you have to understand, like where you are in the world, your space, and how you got there from the very beginning, whether that's your family, your nation, state, or country that brought you there. And so thank you all so much. Thank you, Alex, for bringing in such a great overview, right? Historically, to really ground this conversation. Look for our email over the next couple of days with the resources compiled from the chat, from some that you've all suggested, and look for our invites for future community conversations. Be sure to follow us at HaitianTimes.com on the web, on Facebook, Instagram. Please do. We'll also include the social handles for everyone on the panel today. Thanks again and have a great Sunday, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Anne. You're so wonderful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.